The Batman is finally released in theaters after countless delays that only increased the hype. So today, I'm going to give my ranking of every Batman movie from the worst to the best. I've included all of the full-length Batman movies that were released in theaters, plus Zack Snyder's Justice League, which got enough mainstream attention despite releasing on HBO Max. So with that said, let's jump in and see how I rank these 15 Batman movies from worst to best. In last place, I'm just going to get this one out of the way, we have Batman the Killing Joke. Now, the only reason I decided to include this movie in my ranking is because it was technically released in theaters, and it brings the list to an even 15 movies. So this is really more of an honorable mention, but honestly, I'd be comfortable with having it in last place. While you could argue that the next couple movies on my list are objectively worse, The Killing Joke is especially disappointing because it's a terrible adaptation of one of the greatest graphic novels of all time. The first 30 minutes in particular are just bad, unnecessary filler, and they have basically nothing to do with The Killing Joke. Combined with the other new and slightly altered scenes, it muddles what the overall message of the story is supposed to be. I can understand wanting to expand the story to make the movie longer, but if you're going to add new material, it has to be done in a way that actually makes sense. While the original comic had absolutely stunning artwork, the animation here alternates between passable and cheap looking. Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill are of course great as Batman and Joker respectively. It's great to hear them deliver so many classic lines, and they manage to elevate some of the mediocre material. But that's really a given at this point, and unfortunately it's not enough to save the movie. But if nothing else, it makes me appreciate the comic even more, and I really feel the need to go read it again to get this movie out of my head. So now moving on to the main list, we have Batman and Robin. This movie takes the more fun and campy style of Batman Forever and dials it up to an annoying 11. I understand that they're essentially going for a bigger version of the Adam West TV series, but even that really just feels like an excuse for the movie being annoying and poorly executed. Almost every piece of dialogue is on the nose, cliche, one-dimensional, with way too many ice puns to count. This kind of dialogue only works if I have fun, which I definitely did not. There are some good themes and story moments, but most of them aren't developed nearly enough due to being buried under a ridiculous plot that becomes more convoluted as it goes on. There's also a lot of visual creativity, but the overall production feels cheap and less finely detailed than the last three films. So while I admit that parts of the movie have a certain charm, overall Batman and Robin left me feeling bored and really annoyed. Next, we have the theatrical cut of Justice League. I was actually tempted to put this one below Batman and Robin because while that movie is at least memorable and unique, the theatrical cut of Justice League feels so mediocre and forgettable. Joss Whedon in the studio tried to artificially make it into something it was never meant to be after the fact, and it really shows. The reshoots and added comedy stick out like a sore thumb, especially after seeing the Snyder cut and knowing which footage is which. Because it was mandated to be under 2 hours, the plot has to keep moving by dumping a ton of lazy exposition scenes that carry no weight, and the characters don't have a chance to develop properly as a result. On top of that, most of the movie looks kinda ugly and unfinished. The colors are brightened and oversaturated, and Whedon's cinematography lacks all of the careful detail of Snyder's. Danny Elfman's score has some nice moments, but it mainly feels rushed, and it even resorts to reusing classic themes for Batman and Superman. All of this results in a movie that is not only bad, but feels incredibly out of place from the previous DC Extended Universe movies. I honestly feel almost nothing beyond irritation while watching it, and I think it's time for me to finally commit to never watching this version of the film again. So those are the three low-tier movies that I would actually consider to be bad. Next up are the mid-tier movies that I think are either okay or I have more mixed feelings on. So at number 12 is Batman the Movie. Based on the Adam West TV series, this movie brings the fun and camp of the show to the big screen with a bigger budget and some higher stakes. It's whimsical, silly, over the top, and it feels like everyone involved is having a lot of fun. The score, the dialogue, and the performances are all fun and very memorable. All that being said, this movie is still really flawed. I think it would have been better to either make it a TV movie or just shorten it to a 2 or 3 episode special event. The movie drags a lot in the middle, and it's clear that they're throwing in a bunch of stuff just to fill the runtime. It's certainly a fun time, and it did bring back a lot of childhood nostalgia for me, but overall it doesn't quite hold up all these years later. Then at number 11, we have The Dark Knight Rises. It may be surprising that I put this one so low on the list, but honestly, I don't like this movie movie nearly as much as I used to, and it has a lot of issues that bring it down.
Lots of issues.
Bruce's journey back to being Batman is cool, but it feels redundant when he has to do it all over again in the second half. The first half of the movie also has a lot of unnecessarily complicated setup that could have easily been simplified so that we could move on to the more interesting stuff. That interesting stuff being actually getting to see Batman. For a Batman movie, he really doesn't show up as often as he should. I almost feel like the two different Bruce to Batman plots could have been somehow combined into the first half like in Batman Begins. That way the second half could really focus on him being Batman one last time. Another problem is that the larger themes and ideas that were really well integrated into the first two films feel less subtle and even forced at times, and the movie doesn't always seem to know what message it's going for. Still, all of the actors give fantastic, memorable, and emotionally charged performances, and there is a lot of other good stuff here. The direction, the cinematography, the storytelling, it's all still good, but it doesn't have that same oomph as the first two films. So yeah, it still has some good stuff, but ultimately I can't help but see it as disappointing. Moving into the top 10, we have Batman 1989. This movie takes an interesting approach by building up the mystery of Bruce Wayne and Batman, allowing us to learn about him from the perspective of other characters. However, while this may be a good way to start the movie, this approach often leaves Batman feeling like a supporting character in his own story, which has always been the biggest drawback for me. It also contains some creative decisions that I found to be unnecessary, namely having Joker be the one who killed Batman's parents. On the plus side, the movie is absolutely gorgeous, with the gothic tone and operatic atmosphere always sucking you into the action. Tim Burton is a great visual director, and he absolutely delivers here. Jack Nicholson gives a great performance as the Joker, and while I have mixed feelings on Michael Keaton's Bruce Wayne, I have to admit that he's a pretty great Batman. And of course, I have to give praise to Danny Elfman's excellent score, which perfectly complements the tone of the movie. As great as the comic book and Tim Burton moments are, a lot of the other scenes either feel underwhelming.
Why isn't anyone ever just whelmed?
Or they just don't mesh all that well with the better scenes. I really do want to love this movie, but in the end, there's just too much holding it back for me. Still, there is a lot of fantastic filmmaking on display that deserves recognition, and the movie's influence on later Batman stories can't be understated. Then we have Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, specifically the Ultimate Edition, which presents the movie as Zack Snyder intended it and is my preferred version of the film. Now let me start by saying that I really appreciate a lot of what Zack Snyder was going for, and I do enjoy this movie as part of his larger DC saga. However, on its own, it does have many problems that I have to acknowledge. I like these versions of Batman and Superman, but the script doesn't always do them any favors, with many of their actions being hypocritical and their motivations kind of confusing. I can be forgiving of a different take on existing material since comics have done that for decades, but there's no denying that there were some questionable creative liberties taken with these characters. There are a lot of interesting themes and ideas on display throughout, but at this point we've seen other DC movies and comics that handled similar themes with better execution. Now, of course, there's a lot here that I really enjoy. I'm a big fan of philosophy, so I can be forgiving of less than stellar execution if it means we get a philosophically rich narrative. And while some of the creative choices may make you raise an eyebrow, I at least find them interesting. So yeah, this is one I have a bit of a personal bias for, which is why I can be forgiving of its bigger problems. At number 8 is Batman Returns. Out of all the movies on this list, this one probably surprised me the most. In the past, I haven't enjoyed this one all that much, and every time I reflect on it, I don't remember a lot of things that I loved about it. But this time around, I actually really liked it. To me, Batman Returns feels like a better version of what they were going for with the last film. Everything that was great in the first movie is taken to the next level, and the overall flow and story was a lot more cohesive. The biggest improvement is having more focus on Bruce Wayne and Batman. It's still not perfect, but I found myself more invested in him as a character this time, and they did a much better job of giving him a personal struggle in the story. Penguin and Catwoman are also fun additions, even if they can be too over the top or if they remind me of some tropes that I'm getting a little tired of in comic book movies. There are also some really good themes and use of symbolism, with each of these characters exploring the duality of their personalities and having to figuratively or literally embrace their animal side. And just like the last one, this movie is a visual masterpiece. They really stepped up their game with the cinematography and production design. In the end, I was surprised that I enjoyed Batman Returns a lot more than I used to. I will admit that a lot of my enjoyment comes from the improvements it makes from the last film, but nevertheless, I had a pretty good time with it. Next up at number 7, we have Zack Snyder's Justice League. This movie is a huge improvement over the theatrical cut in almost every way. Now, just like Batman Returns, I do recognize that a lot of my appreciation likely stems from it being an improvement, so I'll go ahead and address the problems that this version has on its own. While I appreciate it being allowed to have a longer runtime, the movie definitely could have been trimmed down to 3 hours and 20 minutes, similar to the theatrical cut of Return of the King. Of course, with this already being an extended cut, I can understand why Snyder chose to go ahead and put everything in while he could, and the additional material that's included always adds to the experience in some way. Parts of the movie are a bit dark visually and tonally for my taste, and while the plot and lore are expanded on greatly from the theatrical cut, there are still a lot of confusing elements that don't fully add up. Despite all that, there's so much to love about this movie. It really feels mythological and epic, which makes the story and characters feel legendary, larger than life. The new score by Junkie XL is fantastic, with a real sense of tension and a cool theme for each character, although it can remain intense when it doesn't really need to, and Wonder Woman's new theme does get a little repetitive. I appreciate Zack Snyder's style, his overall vision for the story, and the little details that make the movie stand out. His use of slow motion, while overused, does help to show off the visuals and immerse you in the moment. I like Zack Snyder's overall vision for his DC saga, and here's to hoping that he's able to finish the story in some way in the future. And now we move into the top 6, the top tier movies that I love the most and would absolutely want to watch again. While this next one may be a bit of a surprise, at number 6 we have Batman Forever. For a long time, my opinion on this movie wasn't all that different from everyone else's, but then I watched High Top Film's excellent video on the movie, which I'll link to down in the description, and it convinced me to give the movie another chance. And you know what? I really enjoyed it, and that stayed true this time around as well. The movie is absolutely campy and silly and is a big departure from the Tim Burton films, but honestly, I think it's just the right amount of goofy fun. And despite how admittedly goofy it is, I have to give credit to Joel Schumacher for still managing to tell a good story for Bruce Wayne. Unlike the Burton films, this movie has a much clearer focus on Bruce Wayne and his struggle with being Batman, with all of the characters and plot lines being incorporated into that nicely. I love just about every character and performance, especially Jim Carrey as the Riddler, who commits 100% and is clearly having an absolute blast. The movie is also very thematically consistent, exploring duality with each of the characters and finding ways to bring all their stories together. Now, with all that said, that's not to say the movie is perfect. A lot of the action feels too choppy, the camp does go too far at times, and the movie could have been a lot more emotionally rich. The deleted scenes offer a glimpse into what could have been, and I highly recommend checking them out. So yeah, I may be biased because of High Top Films, and I absolutely understand why this one doesn't work for a lot of people. For me though, I had an absolute blast with it, and if I'm being honest, I enjoy it way more than the Tim Burton films. It's not perfect, but it is a thoroughly entertaining movie that manages to remain thematically consistent while telling a good Batman story. At number 5, we have the Lego Batman movie. This is easily the most fun Batman movie from start to finish, and I love just about every second of it. The movie has a really fun premise that takes full advantage of Batman lore, the Lego brand, DC Comics, and movie history in general. We get great performances from the entire cast, especially Will Arnett, who fully commits to an overly serious yet still comedic Batman. This is also one of the most gorgeous animated movies I've ever seen. The colors, the vibrant animation, the scale and design, it's all fantastic. However, underneath all of the outrageous fun, the movie has a really touching story for Bruce Wayne that helps to ground the comedy. I'm going to get a little personal here, but one of the reasons this movie has stuck with me is because of how much I related to Bruce's struggle when it came out. I was in my freshman year of college, I didn't have a lot of close friends at the time, and I was dealing with a real sense of loneliness. So I don't know, maybe seeing Batman struggle with the same thing and learn to find a new family by the end was something I really needed to see at the time. And this is all from a Lego movie. Think about that. In the end, this is one of the most fun and surprisingly heartfelt Batman movies ever made that feels like a love letter to both Lego and Batman. Now at number 4, we have Batman Mask of the Phantasm. I love the characterization of Bruce Wayne and Batman, and I was thoroughly invested in him the entire time. There's always this nice use of symbolism for Bruce. Whenever happiness comes into his life, something always happens to interrupt it visually, whether that be the shadow of the moon or a giant swarm of bats. The movie constantly questions what choice Bruce should make about Batman, and in the end, we don't have a perfect clear-cut answer. Just like Bruce. I was also genuinely impressed at how seamlessly the movie balances the main plot, the love interest, Batman's origin, and the Joker all at the same time, while managing to perfectly tie them together by the end. We get top-notch voice acting and perfect characterization all around, especially Mark Hamill as the Joker. The animation and shot composition are still great all these years later, and it feels very fluid with some very nice attention to detail. For all these reasons, Mask of the Phantasm sticks with me and is easily one of the best Batman films to date. Moving into the top 3, we have Batman Begins. I honestly thought this movie was going to take the number 1 spot, and it did come really close. I love Christopher Nolan's direction with this movie. He succeeds in doing Batman justice, making the movie his own, placing Batman in a more realistic setting, and just telling a really good story. This is a near perfectly structured film that weaves through each stage of Bruce's development into Batman. The story has a clear focus on the power of fear, what it means to each of the characters, and how different people put it to use. This helps to thematically tie all the characters and plot lines together, which makes the movie feel very cohesive. Visually, the movie is stunning. It feels very practical with just the right touch of graphic novel aesthetic. The score is absolutely perfect. It's not afraid to be subtle, but it still packs a punch when needed and always succeeds in heightening the action. I love the performances, particularly Christian Bale and Liam Neeson. Bale essentially has to play 3 versions of the same character, and he definitely pulls it off. Batman Begins is a triumph in just about every category, and it set the standard for what Batman and comic book movies would strive to be going forward. Okay, here we go. At number 2, we have The Dark Knight. Nolan expertly crafts every aspect of the movie, creating an experience that is visually immersive with a skillfully developed story. This time around, there's a lot more focus on Bruce being Batman and waging a war on criminals, which is welcome after the last movie dedicated so much time to setting him up as Batman. Heath Ledger gives one of the greatest performances of all time as the Joker. He puts so much care and attention into every bit of the Joker's insanity, and you can see just how much he lost himself in the performance. The score is perfect once again and really takes it to the next level from the last film. After reading Batman: The Long Halloween for the first time recently, I appreciate just how much inspiration the movie takes from outstanding source material. They especially did a great job adapting the dynamic between Batman, Jim Gordon, and Harvey Dent. The Dark Knight has great execution, takes Batman to the next level, and is an all-around great film. And finally, at number 1, we have The Batman. I know, I may be jumping the gun, especially since I've only seen the movie once, but what can I say? It really surprised me. I avoided all the marketing for this movie and tried to remain as spoiler-free as possible, so I really thought that it was only gonna be number 4 at most. But despite going into it with almost no expectations and having largely avoided the hype, I really loved this movie. While Batman Begins and The Dark Knight are fantastic movies and succeed at putting Batman in a more realistic setting, they admittedly lose some of the charm of the comics they're based on. The Batman, on the other hand, truly feels like a graphic novel brought to life. I won't go too in-depth plot-wise since the movie just came out, but I will say this movie was an amazing experience. I love seeing a detective-focused, slow-paced, and methodical Batman story. The tone, the lighting, it all works so well. The action scenes carry so much weight. You really feel every punch rattle your bones. Seeing the movie in XD definitely helps. And Robert Pattinson is a fantastic Batman, maybe the best live-action Batman we've gotten to this point. He carries himself perfectly in the suit and truly embodies the Dark Knight, in my opinion. His Bruce Wayne also displays so much pain and feels very detached from everything around him. Pattinson does a great job of making Bruce feel like the disguise that Batman wears. Another element I was surprised that I ended up really liking was that the movie isn't afraid to challenge Batman or call out his mistakes. While a little off-putting at first, this helps to create create a story about Batman learning what kind of hero he needs to be. Now, despite all of the great stuff that I've talked about, I will say that the movie maybe could have used a little more new stuff to help it stand out, but nevertheless, it is a fantastic adaptation, and the movie does make up for it with its style and execution. I love what Matt Reeves did with this movie, and I feel like he really understands what makes Batman so special. I mean, you know a movie is good when it's 3 hours long and you want it to keep going once it's over. And as cautious as I was about this being the start of a new movie universe before having seen it, now I cannot wait to see more. Maybe in time I will change my mind once the hype has died down. For right now though, I absolutely love it, and I feel pretty confident giving the #1 spot to The Batman. So there's my ranking of all 15 Batman movies. What's your Batman movie ranking? What are some of your other favorite and least favorite Batman movies that I didn't include on this list? If you've had a chance to see The Batman, what are your first impressions? Well, time to bring this one to a close. Thanks for watching. Remember to enjoy life, and swear to me that you'll subscribe. Wow, that was a really bad Batman voice. I'm just gonna go now.